All right, hello, and welcome to Structured Decision Making for Hurricane Response. We'll be talking to you today about how we apply the theoretical approach to our own resiliency procedures. So, little intro about Stormgeo. I am the Vice President of Cross Industry. I'm also a meteorologist here at Stormgeo. I've been here for about 3 years now with a Master's of Ocean Science and Technology and a Bachelor's of Science degree in meteorology from Texas A&M University. Allison, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, I'm Allison Severity, as Cortland mentioned, the Managing Director here at Stormgeo. My background is I have a Bachelor of Science degree in meteorology from 2005 from the University of Oklahoma, and I have spent my entire career working with Stormgeo and have worked from the meteorologist perspective on the forecast desk, as well as in client services, and most recently as the Managing Director.
All right, thank you, Allison. So a little bit about Stormgeo. We are a global weather forecasting company. So we operate 24 offices around the world with 8 operation centers, about more than 500 employees around the world. We provide 24/7, 365 support to all of our clients, and we have full staffs of meteorologists in all of our operation centers. In terms of industries we serve a number of industries. So you'll hear about us in the shipping industry. We do provide support to about 12,000 vessels and route about 65,000 voyages annually in the shipping department. We do serve renewables, where we provide wind and social energy support in Europe, and also about 9,000 unique forecasts per month in renewables. We do serve oil and gas. We monitor about 1,400 offshore installations daily and issue about 90,000 unique forecasts per month. Lastly, we also have our cross-industry section that we provide 23,000 forecasts issued daily to our U.S. location, and we also monitor about 74,000 additional assets daily. Additionally, we also have a media sector. So we do provide about 20 million unique consumers worldwide information, and we also offer scalable solutions with multi-language support and relevant content in our media department. In terms of weather's impact, so we all know that, weather has a significant impact in business disruption. It doesn't matter if you're oil and gas, banking, healthcare. Weather is the biggest disruptor of your operations. So from 2010 to 2019, it was marked the costliest decade on record, with economic damage reaching $2.98 trillion, which is about $1.19 trillion higher than the previous decade. Now, in terms of billion-dollar catastrophes, in the past few years, you'll notice a difference in numbers. Something significant here is in 2017, you'll notice that we had 16 total billion-dollar catastrophes in the United States, but that was a massive $319 billion year, and that is because about 300 of it was from Hurricane Harvey down on the Texas coast. So very impactful. So far, all the way through 2020, we had a record number of billion-dollar catastrophes, totaling to $22 billion catastrophes, reaching a cost of $95 billion, a bit over 2018. So this should show you, weather is always going to be a consistent player in terms of disrupting our business, and it's important to be responding as a result. So now Allison is going to discuss a bit about how to create a response plan based on correctly defined triggers and timelines, and I will hand it over to you, Allison.
Thank you, Cortland. So I'll take some time today to talk about hurricane response plans, as well as what we like to call our hurricane response plan trigger report, and the development of that trigger report as an enhanced service. So what makes an effective timeline? Well, an effective timeline is going to take into account all the different actionable items within a response plan. Shutdown and evacuation. If writing out what scenarios might make sense for protecting your most valuable assets, employees, as well as your business. Having the proper triggers, meaning soft versus hard triggers, takes into account a lot of uncertainty within a forecast and can help you respond better. Being a meteorologist and dealing with uncertainty comes with experience. If I had a dime for every time I heard the saying, well, meteorologists can be wrong 50% of the time and still have a job, I'd have a lot of dimes. Now, we like to take into account a probabilistic approach, which we think works the best. We also like to take into account recovery, making a plan for recovery. Your employees are fatigued, and you want to take into account how much time is it going to take to resume your business as usual. So what we like to do is take into account all the steps that you can take to prepare your employees to continue their operations after a major event. And lastly, practice. Practice may not always make it perfect, but with each experience comes an opportunity to improve your plan. Now, having an action timeline is one of the first steps to developing an effective response plan. An action timeline includes very specific actions to be taken into account within a given time limitation prior to the arrival of a storm. There are soft trigger points, and there are also hard trigger points. Some of those soft trigger points would include making hotel reservations ahead of time. Hard trigger points are a little bit more hard to distinguish and determine, but shutdown and evacuation of a facility are very specific hard trigger points that need to be taken into account. Now, if you have any of the following triggers in your hurricane response plan, you might consider updating that plan. The first one being proximity to your location, taking into account the Saffir-Simpson category. I'll go into a little bit more detail, but the Saffir-Simpson scale is a wind scale, and we'll go into some detail about how storm surge should be thought about and responded to, not taking into account the specific Saffir-Simpson category. Another issue might be taking into account the wind estimated time of arrival based solely on a deterministic forecast. Now, proximity triggers don't consider the size and speed of movement or the forecast track. So if you have a timeline looks like this, you might see a tropical storm or hurricane entering or heading towards the Gulf of Mexico from the Eastern Caribbean Sea. Just because it's entering the Gulf of Mexico, does that necessarily mean you need to take action? Well, in this example, we have Hurricane Wilma. This was in 2005. Hurricane Wilma is down in the history books as the most intense tropical cyclone in the Atlantic Basin. At this point, Hurricane Wilma is in a close proximity to the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. You can see the X marked right there on the Texas-Louisiana border, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming to that specific location. In this specific instance, Hurricane Wilma was tracking to the northwest across the Caribbean. However, across the Gulf of Mexico, Bay of Campeche, there was a strong southwest flow aloft. And with that strong southwest flow, that meant the steering currents were going to steer Wilma actually towards the northeast and towards the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula. It's very difficult for a non-meteorologist to identify the threat, any threats that's developing out in the Atlantic Caribbean Sea. In this instance, we have a disturbance developing in the Eastern Caribbean, but we as Stormgeo have developed what we call our response plan activator, that's RPA for short, where our expert meteorologists identify these threats. And then we also identify areas of coastline that could potentially be under threat in the coming days as a storm develops and heads towards land. In this instance, we would go RPA positive for areas of Cuba as well as the Yucatan Peninsula and Central America. as well as the coast of Mexico, Texas, and Louisiana. And this is several days in advance, a general tap on the shoulder to let you know that there is a risk. It's a good time to start dusting off your hurricane response plan and be aware that there could be a potential storm affecting your operations in the coming days. We also use our Hurricane Severity Index. This is HSI for short. It has many advantages over the Saffir-Simpson scale. The HSI is a 50-point scale. It allots up to 25 points for the max sustained winds. That's the intensity of the storm, as well as up to 25 points for the size of the wind field. Now, I'll walk you through an example of how the HSI can help tell the story about a specific storm and help convey the actual impact that the storm can have. So max sustained winds do not necessarily provide a good estimate of the potential damage of a storm surge across a region. The extent of the hurricane force wind field is what determines the extent of the storm surge. So this is Hurricane Ivan in 2004 versus Hurricane Dennis in 2005, both Category 3 storms, max winds 120 miles per hour sustained. However, you can see in the left image, this pink and red shaded area is the core of the hurricane force wind field, and this is what is going to generate storm surge. The HSI size component at landfall for Ivan was 20 out of 32 points total for the HSI for size. As comparison for Dennis, a much smaller storm, a much smaller footprint for those hurricane force winds, and you can see only a size 6 for 6 points allotted to the category, the size component for the HSI for Dennis. So as you can see, damage 15 billion versus 2.2 billion. So the response to Ivan, of course, was much larger and more devastating than what was seen with Hurricane Dennis. Now, the Saffir-Simpson scale is a hurricane wind scale and should not be used to estimate potential storm surge. This is an image of Hurricane Ike as it ravaged the Bolivar Peninsula, the upper Texas coast back in 2008. Remember, Hurricane Ike was only a Category 2 when it made landfall. However, the storm surge was absolutely devastating. You can see in this particular image, there's one, maybe two houses standing left in this very resort and filled area. This Bolivar Peninsula is known to have to be a very big tourist attraction. So as you can see, the damage was just very devastating. So Hurricane Ike itself did produce a range of storm surge, anywhere from 8 to 10 feet on the far southwestern portions of Galveston, and up towards 14 and 19 feet as you head towards Bolivar Peninsula, High Island area, northern portions of the bay, 13 to 17 feet. But where we really saw that over 21 feet of storm surge was here in the southwestern part of the Galveston Bay area down near Texas City. Hurricane Katrina back in 2005 was a Category 3 storm, so it is categorized as a major storm, which is 3, 4, and 5. It produced a larger storm surge than what Category 5 Hurricane Camille back in 1969. So storm surge is mostly a function of the size of a hurricane's wind field and the vulnerability of a particular coastline, not its Saffir-Simpson category. I'll go into a little bit about the bathymetry of the coastal locations. So coastal locations with relatively shallow water extending well offshore will be much more prone to storm surge. Areas including Vermilion Bay, Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, as well as the western Florida Peninsula, these areas highlighted in red, actually have relatively shallow water areas offshore. So that means as the storm is making landfall, that surge is more likely to be devastating in those areas because they have that shallower water extending offshore. In the areas that are further out, so the South Texas coast, the mouth of the Mississippi River, we see that, those areas, as well as near Pensacola, there's deep waters offshore, not expected to receive as much storm surge at those particular locations. Now, also when predicting potential storm surge, I also have to take into account the track forecast error. In this example, Katrina, there was about a 10% chance of it tracking as far to the west as the Vermilion Bay area there in central Louisiana, or as far east as the Florida Panhandle. You just need to take into consideration this probabilistic nature when calculating the storm surge and the path. You have to take into account the actual forecast track to determine exactly where the storm surge is going to occur. So, basically want to evaluate your risk for storm surge and base your evacuation orders on the probabilistic figures that are determined by meteorologists, not necessarily the Saffir-Simpson category. Now, getting back to the hurricane response timeline, most plans do not adequately deal with uncertainty of the forecast track. Taking a closer look, what does out mean? So 84 hours prior to Hurricane Ike making landfall, there was forecast to strike the lower to middle Texas coastline. As we all know, Hurricane Ike made landfall in Galveston. So if you're taking a look at this several days out, you have to understand that there is uncertainty within the forecast track that can change with each coming forecast. If taking a look at the 39 mile per hour wind field and not just the specific forecast track, then your response plan looking at just the forecast time of arrival will fail. So at this point, Houston was outside of that 39 mile per hour wind field. Therefore, basing the response on the deterministic forecast was quite risky. Now, taking into account the worst case scenario, we use, this is another one of our timeline tools, WCS is what we like to call it, the worst case scenario. It takes into account the uncertainty in a forecast track and allows you to make decisions based on a realistic timeline if the storm tracks directly towards your location. It helps you understand how much time you have to react, taking into account potential forecast track errors. The worst case arrival time must be paired with the probability that the storm will impact your location. Now, the potential arrival time should be paired with the probability of wind impact for a better objective trigger. Based on the forecast track and predicted storm size, we calculate those probabilities. We actually calculate the probabilities for all the various wind fields. We do it for 25 miles per hour, 39, 58, 75, and 100, or 74 actually, which is hurricane force wind. So what we typically do though is take a close look at that 58 mile per hour wind field, and that 58 mile per hour wind field represents the core of a storm. It's a wind field that does not fluctuate as much as the hurricane force and the tropical storm force. That's your 74 and 39 mile per hour wind fields. It tends to stay relatively concise, and it's also the wind field that can have destruction of power lines. It's when bridges and overpasses and roads become impassable. So we want to make sure that that you have everything buttoned up and that you're looking out for the potential impact of that 58 mile per hour wind field. And we take that account into your hurricane response timeline by what we've done is we've taken a study of past storms using that probability of wind impact of that 58 mile per hour wind field, the hurricane's core, and pairing it with the worst case arrival of that 39 mile per hour wind field. And you'll see these ranges of values. This is the actual study itself for those specific storms. This image kind of breaks it down a little bit, and in this study, we looked at specific locations where the storm did hit, as well as locations for storms that the storm actually turned away from their specific location. So in the days prior to landfall, you want to look at those PWI values for the 59 or 58 mile per hour wind field to determine your level of risk. If you are more risk tolerant, you want to pick higher values. If you have lower risk tolerance, you're going to want to pick lower values within these categories for these specific time steps in order to trigger your specific phases at an earlier time point. So just depending on whether or not you can stand a little bit more uncertainty or risk tolerance within your response will help you determine exactly which values you should go with. So we'll walk through a sample of this. We'll look specifically at this 96-hour trigger point and walk through what this would look like as we reassign the values to replace what 96 hours out looks like. So here we're going to start with the 96 hours out trigger. Looking back at the graphic from the previous page, you'll see these values at that 96-hour time step. We typically see a percentage range between 8% and 23% for a storm that is potentially within 96 hours of impacting your location. But what value should be used? Well, what percentage you choose depends upon the type of action or actions that you're taking in this phase of your plan. For example, if at 96 hours, the only decision is whether or not to hold a second daily meeting to discuss further actions, then the timing is somewhat flexible. However, if you're looking to choose a higher percentage, if you have something that's more meaningful, such as you're looking to potentially shut down and evacuate, then you might want to choose a value that has a higher percentage at this particular time step. And that's reserved mainly for the critical actions, such as shutting down your facility. It's something that you wouldn't want to miss if the forecast uncertainty leads to a stronger storm for your location. If at 96 hours you have to take a critical action, like shutting down your facility, missing that 96-hour time point could be costly, then you would want to opt to go with a value closer to about 8% to make sure that if the storm speeds up, you'll still have time for that 96-hour action going out in time. So your phase 3 trigger then turns out to look like this. The 96-hour action is taken when the worst case arrival of the tropical storm force winds and when it's potentially within 96 hours and the probability of wind impact of the 58-mile-per-hour wind field hitting your location is greater or equal to 15%. Only if both of these conditions are met would you advance your response plan to phase 3. This basically takes the guesswork out of deciding when to act, and therefore your response team does not have to be playing meteorologist. Now, what we would do is take your entire hurricane response plan and break it down to use these objective triggers. So the final plan with objective triggers would look something like this. The subjective X hours out triggers are now gone, replaced by objective triggers combining the PWI and the probability of wind impact and worst case arrival times. Now, within 48 hours, we typically focus on the forecast time of arrival of the winds, as by that time, the track error is generally minimal. Now, for locations vulnerable to storm surge, we could also incorporate the HSI, the Hurricane Severity Index size component that we previously talked about. We can include that in your triggers for your evacuation timeline. And so these triggers are fully customizable as necessary. And you'll see these acronyms here at the bottom, WCS 39. So we're looking at that worst case scenario arrival of the 39-mile-per-hour winds, probability of wind impact to the 58-mile-per-hour wind field. We look at these two combined. And then we also, once we're within 48 hours, we start taking a close look at that forecast time of arrival of that 39-mile-per-hour wind field. Now, these objective triggers can be incorporated into a trigger report that tells you when certain actions should be taken. We take into account in this particular report current storm status, current plan phase, and the projected next phase. We include helpful graphics and images. This is your site forecast. This is the scope of winds, as well as the track map. And we also include forecast and worst case arrival time of both of those wind fields, so 39 mile per hour, 58, as well as a 74, to help you understand what those critical values are and how they are taken into account here in the actual the phase, the trigger parameters within your hurricane plan that suggest where you need to be in your response, which phase, as well as when the next phase is expected to be reached. Right, so a good hurricane response plan also needs to go beyond landfall, and it needs to go over and incorporate the recovery phase of your response as well. You want to have good communication set up within your organization. Do you have 24-hour operations that would require a generator to be on site in the event that commercial power were to be lost? Do you have a safe emergency operations center where personnel can continue the response? And do you also have set up employee services, rescue operations as needed? We saw, of course, a lot of this during the landfall of Harvey. Another important item is to train your employees how to prepare for a hurricane. Many times people may be new to the Houston area, may not be familiar with how to respond when a hurricane is threatening. It's best to have them prepared ahead of time, put together a hurricane kit, and have that ready as soon as the beginning of hurricane season. But of course, it's never too late to put together a kit. Update your hurricane plan with each season. Each season we have new experiences. We, of course, last year learned a lot from Hurricane Laura, which we'll go through our response to Laura a little bit later in this presentation, but it's always helpful to have a drill each year or regularly to make sure that that your plan has all the bases covered that it needs to from year to year. And with that, I will turn this over to Cortland to further discuss objective decision guidance based on risk response phases.
All right, thank you, Allison. Great presentation on triggers. So as Allison mentioned, I'm going to be walking you through kind of an objective overview of what you should be kind of incorporating into your response plans and the phases that you should have in those plans, in addition to the categories that you should be paying attention to, and each of the categories that you should kind of group your preparations in. So of course, you start in business as usual mode. Of course, you're going to be here until there's an impending weather event that potentially impacts you and your business. In each of these phases, you'll have an assessment, a communication, and mitigation category where you'll need to pay attention to different items in each of those phases. Once a weather event is identified, you will then move into the awareness phase. And as that weather event develops, you will then move into the monitoring, preparation, and onset phases. Once the storm event has passed and you have experienced impacts or not, you will then move into the post-event phase where you will evaluate those impacts. So let's walk through each of those phases. The first one I mentioned is business as usual. And again, this is assessed daily. You're likely monitoring your locations on kind of an overview, situational awareness approach. You're probably getting, forecasts for each of those locations daily. This is the stage that you'll be in all the time when you are not moving into your preparation mode for an impending weather event. In this stage, you'll want to communicate all clear messaging where appropriate. If that applies to your operations, then of course, please continue that as part of this phase. But this phase is really where you should be aligning the right stakeholders that are going to be a part of your response whenever that may occur. Make sure that you have all of those stakeholders informed on what they would be doing. Start aligning them on their responsibilities. This is the time to be making those preparations so that you don't run into any hiccups during an actual event. In addition, this is a great time to be moving into kind of focusing on your mitigation section. So, if you need a co-location for your operations, conduct drills at those co-locations so people know how to operate at that co-location. This is a great time to be updating and maintaining your employee contact lists, as well as your external resource list, which is very important that you have those relationships and contacts updated. So when you do need those resources, you can call on them as needed. You'll want to be running a drill with your mass communications with your employees. This is important so that they know, how to be communicating back and forth with you during an impactful weather event. In addition to that, you'll want to conduct employee preparedness education. So really make sure that all of your employees are on the same page in terms of how they should be preparing at work as well as at home when these situations arise. And then lastly, you can conduct scenario drills and tabletops. This is really good to walk through all of the teams that are going to be involved in the response plan, so that they know exactly how they should be responding when you're ready to call on them. Now, once you identify, kind of get that first tug on the sleeve that a weather event may impact your operations, this is when you'll move into the awareness phase. So you'll assess this during business hours. It's not very critical yet, but you're probably watching a forecast, seeing that you may, in a week or so, be impacted by a significant system. You may, Allison mentioned trigger reports. You may start to get a trigger report about the forecast. And at this point, you're probably in the monitoring phase of that trigger report scenario. So for communication, this is when you'll want to kind of notify your management and HR teams so that they're well aware that you're likely going to be moving into a response plan activation if it develops as you think it does. But you'll want to continue business as usual communications. At this point in time, things are not critical yet to be changing these communications. And with that, you'll also continue business as usual execution. At this point in time, though, you'll want to be sure that you're updating and topping off your emergency supplies because, especially if you have a private weather provider or you're getting forecasts ahead of when kind of the general public gets them, you'll want to kind of get ahead of that rush on supplies, putting you in a terrible situation. So be sure to update and top off these supplies as early in this phased approach as possible. Once that forecast starts to develop, a couple of days go by, you're starting to see that, impacts are probably going to be imminent. You're going to want to start assessing the situation continuously 24/7 as appropriate. At this point, you should be getting forecasts and identifying which locations are at risk. If you have multiple locations, be getting detailed forecast information and timing for your locations. And then in terms of communication, you're going to want to, involve management, update HR as needed, but this is when you're going to start notifying your employees. In addition, you're going to notify your incident command task force. This is the team that's going to be responsible for responding to this event. They're going to need to know that, okay, we're ready to start responding, be ready to be called on when we need you. This is the phase that you'll notify them. Lastly, you'll want to notify your damage assessment team. Now, we're not post-storm, so obviously they don't need to do anything yet, but cluing this team in at this point in time will give them much more context into what the forecast was, how the storm developed, what they experienced, and then they'll be able to do their assessment at the end in the post-storm phase in a more accurate and concise way. In terms of mitigation, you'll want to continue your business as usual execution. You're not being affected yet, but this is where you'll want to establish a briefing schedule. Get those weather briefings established with a meteorologist, get those leadership briefings established so that you can stick with this consistent schedule throughout the rest of the response and everyone is on the same page. You'll also want to look at operational schedules. You'll want to review these and kind of determine whether you'll be changing operational schedules based on the expected impacts or not. That depends on your specific business makeup, but this is when you'll want to be evaluating it so that you aren't caught off guard as the event approaches in a few days or so. Once we continue to move closer and closer to that event occurring, at your location. You'll continually monitor this 24/7 as before. At this point, you'll have identified which locations are at most risk. You'll be getting trigger reports and detailed information on expected impacts at your locations. This is where you'll want to activate the incident command task force. So the previous phase is letting them know, giving them a heads up. This phase is when you really need to activate that incident command task force so that they can continue with the response moving forward. You'll also want to prepare your damage assessment team for deployment. So at this point in time, you should probably have more specific forecast information so you can kind of estimate when they will be needed. That, of course, can change with forecasts. We understand they'll need to have some sort of flexibility. But at this point, they should be preparing for a general framework of when they will be needed post-storm. In terms of mitigation, at this point, you'll adjust your business as usual operations. So, if you need to secure co-location or move to a co-location, you'll want to secure co-location accommodations before you have a team move to them so that when they do migrate to that co-location, the migration is efficient and there aren't any hurdles that get in the way of that. You'll adjust operational schedules at this time to what you discussed in the previous phase. You'll also, of course, your response protocols are enabled. Your incident command task force is moving on this. And you'll want to encourage employee preparation. Now, I mentioned education on this earlier on, but employees should be preparing at home, and you should encourage that as much as possible in this stage so that they will be able to focus on the preparations that they need to make at work. Once everything is set at home and they feel like everything's prepared, they'll be able to switch their focus to what their responsibilities are in terms of making preparations for work. You'll also want to establish formal remote work instructions. This is really important, and I know during kind of the new normal with the pandemic, a lot of people may already have remote work situations, but if you are someone or a organization who doesn't, and there's a possibility that you may have to move into remote work or a remote work setting, it's important to establish specific and very clear guidelines on what you expect for remote work. Work and being online expectations, communication expectations, timelines, things like that to make sure that, if the employees somehow don't have any way of contacting you in the worst case scenario, they at least know, what is expected and what should they be doing to kind of move forward with the post-event response. Now, you will move into the onset phase as soon as you're kind of experiencing the storm. So at this point, most of your preparations are finished. A lot of it, the significant preparations happened in the last phase. Now you are just kind of writing out the system, writing out this event until you can move into the post-event phase. So of course, you'll be monitoring this on a 24/7 basis, making sure you're monitoring your facilities, your operations, your employees, all kind of hands on deck at this point in time. You're probably getting specific forecasts, briefings from meteorologists, and real-time alerts. At this point, the storm is kind of at your doorstep, so you should be receiving those real-time live alerts. In terms of communication, of course, you're always going to be involving management and HR and updating your employees as you have updates to give them. But you're also going to want to be checking on the status of your employees actively throughout this entire phase. So using your established communication method, you're going to want to reach out to your employees, confirm who needs assistance, who is okay, who has internet, who doesn't. All of those specific details will help you as a team and a response team really kind of identify where you need to put your hands in terms of response and who is okay. So this will be very helpful in terms of getting all of your employees back on track once the event passes. In addition, you'll want to establish duty of care communications. Now, this is important externally, specifically. So if you have customers or, public residents or anyone who you deal with externally, you're going to want to ensure that you're, actively preparing for this weather event, that you're taking all of the precautions. If you're a 24/7 operation, that you are doing everything you can to maintain 24/7 operations. This is where you'll want to make sure that externally everyone knows that you are taking that duty of care to make sure that you are doing everything you can to respond accordingly to this weather event. In terms of mitigation, most of it is generally the same at this point. So you'll generally just be writing out the system and making sure that your employees are monitored and their need of assistance is updated. Now, once the event completely passes and you don't have any further impacts from the system, then you'll move into the post-event phase. So you'll move back into assessing this during business hours. Of course, you're not receiving any additional impacts, so you don't necessarily need to do a 24/7 assessment, but something to note is you may still have critical weather operations for your recovery, especially if you've been significantly impacted by this event. So it's important to be getting things like critical temperature advisories or, other types of weather forecasts to be sure that, you're still monitoring the weather forecast while you're in your recovery phase. In terms of communication, keep management, HR, and your employees updated on your situation. Depending on the severity, there could be lengths of time where, employees are in kind of an interim situation where it's not necessarily back to normal. This is very important to make sure that your communications are frequent and detailed at this point in time. You'll want to execute those post-event schedules. So in previous phases, you figured out kind of future operational schedules. These post-event schedules may be modified from your normal business as usual operations. So at this point, depending on your amount of impact, that will determine kind of which post-event schedule you move forward with. At this point in time, your damage assessment team is identifying kind of, they should be evaluating damage, moving through with the recovery response. So at this point, you'll continue that deployment and support them as needed. And additionally, you'll want to deploy your employee assistance team. So this is where that communication in the onset phase of who needs help and who doesn't is going to really help this team to kind of respond and help them as needed. And lastly, you're going to want to deploy maintenance. Of course, if you were significantly impacted, you might need a lot of maintenance. In addition, you're going to want to, potentially gather as much information as possible, potentially from a private weather provider. If you can get impact reports or specific detailed weather reports on what types of impacts you did receive at your location. This will be very helpful for both maintenance, but also for insurance claims so that you can get the funding you need in order to safely recover and fully get yourselves back to normal. So that was an overview of just kind of an objective suggestion on how to set up your response plan phases and the different categories that you should be paying attention to in each of those phases. Now, I'm going to hand it back over to Allison, who's going to move through Stormgeo's response in 2020 and give you a real life example of this theory in action. Allison?
Thank you, Cortland. I'll start this last leg of our presentation by going into detail about how Stormgeo prepares for and responds to an emergency. We, of course, are located in the Houston area, so on the northwestern Gulf Coast. And so we have a specific and unique situation where we have to prepare to respond to hurricanes, but we also have a 24-hour operation center where we have to prepare for all of our employees to be impacted and continue our operations throughout any potential emergency, including hurricanes. So 2020 was quite a record year. Of course, we had a record number of storms, several of which posed a threat to the Houston area, but most specifically Hurricane Laura. And I will, through this example, walk you through what we did as far as our response. First, we'll talk a little bit about how Stormgeo takes an all hazards approach, and we like to identify all types of hazards that could have a potential to cause business disruption. And we prepare situational awareness. We have an assessment to determine what those incident objectives are for each type of response. And we go through this kind of checklist, if you will, in our emergency preparedness plan. So for Hurricane Laura, we had, this is our emergency or our incident management team here in the Houston office of Stormgeo. And each year we go through, we have an annual hurricane response exercise where we go through a drill storm scenario. For this year, 2021, we actually had our drill storm scenario which was the actual Hurricane Laura event from last year. Now, with our business continuity plan, we have a very specific hurricane timeline that we follow. And as we discussed earlier, the development of that trigger report, we have taken the steps to put together our own trigger report for our phased response to any hurricane risk to our operations here in Houston. So during Laura, due to the risk of tropical conditions, the Stormgeo incident management team, we activated all phases within our hurricane prep timeline. This is the first time that the Stormgeo Houston office has had to do this since 2008, since Hurricane Ike. This was the first time we escalated all phases of our hurricane response plan, including activating our alternate work location. So we, the incident management team, decided to start meeting in a daily time frame beginning Friday, the 21st of August. We activated our incident management team with the activation of the response plan Activator positive. So at this point, we began in phase 1 of our hurricane prep timeline. By Sunday, we escalated to phase 2 of our hurricane prep timeline. We continued to escalate throughout the week as the forecast, of course, was becoming more ominous for Southeast Texas. And by Tuesday, we escalated to phase 3 and 4. We declared with Agility, which is our alternate work location that we have set up in College Station. Because we are a 24-hour operations center, we also have a data center on site. We cannot afford to have any of our personnel be offline. And of course, we are, due to the pandemic, we're still working in the dispersed working environment. So we actually have 2 alternate work locations. We have the actual Houston office, but we also have this alternate work location with Agility. So by Wednesday, the incident management team activated an away team and a ride-out team, which both were deployed. The ride-out team was sent to our Houston office location, which is a building that it's a hardened facility with backup internet, as well as a backup power supply due to our generator that's on site. And then we also sent a team up to College Station in the event that our generator went offline due to the potential damage from Hurricane Laura. We had a separate team, the away team, already deployed in another backup facility to make sure that we could continue operations if necessary. Now by Thursday, overnight Wednesday into Wednesday night, midnight into Thursday morning is when Laura made landfall. Of course, it did make landfall further to the east, just south of the Lake Charles area. The incident management team did activate phase 6, which is all clear and recovery for our Houston area employees. Now, within our response, there were actually 2 responses. We had the business continuity response, which was making sure that our employees were taken care of. But then we also had an operational and external response to make sure that our clients were taken care of. In the operational response, we, Stormgeo, had a very high volume of conference call support to our clients. This was starting on August the 20th. We had about 7 calls. Then you can see a substantial spike by that Friday up to 35 calls. This is in one day, 35 calls administered. By Monday, that number jumped to 58 calls. By Tuesday, we broke our previous record that was set during Hurricane Harvey of 60 calls a day. We had a total of 72, and then the very next day we broke that record of 77 calls prior to Laura making landfall that Thursday. So Thursday we fielded about 50 calls. These are conference calls, dedicated support with meteorologists on a call with our client, explaining the current storm situation, what to expect at their location. If they have a trigger report, then it goes into detail about what phase in their response plan they should be in, etc. So by this point, end of the week on Friday, the calls, of course, began dropping off as the storm moved further inland, and we entered into the recovery phase of the response, and we returned to normal after this. However, there was still a slight uptick in calls due to a chemical release in the area of southeastern Louisiana or southwestern Louisiana. There also utility industry was affected in that area, and we're asking for additional phone call support during that time as well. So this will wrap our presentation, and would like to say thank you for listening, and really appreciate your support. Cortland, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just thank you, and good luck with the rest of the hurricane season.